She turned down 7 proposals in 2 years. 7 men, wealthy, respected, powerful, and she said no to every single one. The whole town of Blackridge thought Evelyn Mercer was impossible to please. They whispered about her pride, her stubbornness, maybe even her sanity. But the truth? The truth was standing 50 feet away every single morning, shoveling hay and pretending he didn't notice her. This is the story of 2 people who loved each other in silence for years, and the one moment that nearly cost them everything. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. The morning Evelyn Mercer turned down Robert Calloway's proposal, she was standing behind the counter of her father's dry goods store with flour on her sleeve and a headache building behind her left eye. It wasn't a bad proposal, as proposals went. Robert had planned it carefully. She could tell by the way he'd put on his good jacket despite the heat, and by the small velvet box he pulled from his breast pocket with the careful deliberateness of a man who had practiced the motion in private. He was 34, owned 312 acres of good grazing land east of town, and had never once been accused of cruelty toward his horses or his workers. In Blackridge, Wyoming, in the spring of 1883, that combination made him about as eligible as a man could reasonably hope to be. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice only cracked a little. "I've been thinking on this for some time now. I believe we'd make a solid partnership. I'd treat you well. I swear it." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, the flower on her sleeve, the headache, the velvet box. "Robert," she said quietly, "I think very highly of you. I truly do." He closed his eyes before she could finish. He already knew. "But I can't accept," she said. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, tucked the box back into his pocket with the same careful deliberateness, and walked out. The bell above the door chimed twice as it swung shut behind him. Evelyn stood alone in the store and listened to the sound die away, and then she went back to entering numbers in her father's ledger because there was nothing else to do. That was the 7th time in 2 years. The town of Blackridge in 1883 was the kind of place that had opinions about everything and time enough to share them. It sat in a wide valley with the Laramie Mountains pressing against the western sky, close enough to feel enormous on certain kinds of afternoons, distant enough on others to seem painted on. The town had a post office, 2 saloons, a church, a schoolhouse, a doctor who drank more than he should, and roughly 460 souls who all knew each other's business with the comfortable intimacy of people who had survived hard winters together. They knew Evelyn Mercer's business, certainly. She was the only daughter of Thomas Mercer, who ran the best-stocked dry goods store between Cheyenne and Casper. Thomas was a fair man, not wealthy exactly, but stable. The kind of stable that mattered on the frontier, where today's fortune could become tomorrow's ashes with a single bad drought or a cattle disease moving through the county. He'd raised Evelyn mostly alone after her mother passed of fever when Evelyn was 11, and he'd done it imperfectly in the way that single fathers do. Too much practicality, not enough softness, a tendency to solve emotional problems with inventory work. Evelyn had turned out, by most accounts, just fine. She was 26 now, which in 1883 meant that the town had been quietly expecting her to be married for at least 4 years. She was not what you'd call classically beautiful in the way of the Gibson illustrations that were starting to appear in the Eastern magazines. Her nose was slightly crooked from a childhood fall. She had a habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking that some people found severe. Her hands were capable hands, not delicate ones. She could lift a 50-pound flour sack without flinching, and she did, regularly, without waiting for anyone to help her. But there was something about her, something that was hard to name precisely. She had a quality of attention. When she looked at you, she actually looked, and it made men feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. She laughed easily, but not at everything. She had opinions and didn't soften them much, but she'd also listen to your side of the argument without her eyes going distant the way people's eyes did when they were only waiting for their turn to talk. 7 men had noticed this quality and decided they wanted to spend their lives next to it. 7 times, she had said no. The question the town asked, the question that floated through the 2 saloons and the church pews and the quilting circles with the persistence of a bad smell, was why. The theories were numerous. Martha Hensley, who ran the boarding house and had elevated speculation to something approaching fine art, believed Evelyn was waiting for a man from back east, some city gentleman with clean hands and a university education. She's too refined for what we've got here, Martha said, with the confidence of a woman who had decided this and stopped considering alternatives. Old Pete Dawson, who spent most of his days on the bench outside the post office watching the street, had a different theory. The girl's just particular, he said. Nothing wrong with particular. My second wife was particular and she was worth the waiting. No one pointed out that Pete's second wife had left him after 8 months and moved to Denver. It seemed unkind. The younger women in town, the ones who had married at 19 or 20, the way everyone expected, tended to split between two camps. Half of them admired Evelyn quietly and would never say so in front of their husbands. The other half thought she was making a mistake that she'd regret when 30 arrived and then 35. Thomas Mercer himself, when the subject was raised by well-meaning neighbors, said only that his daughter was capable of making her own decisions. Thank you, and changed the subject to the price of dry goods from the Cheyenne suppliers, which was a subject he could discuss at length. None of them were right, of course. Not even close. The truth was this. Evelyn Mercer had been in love with Silas Boone since she was 22 years old, and she had decided somewhere in the quiet chambers of her own heart that she would wait for him to see it. She had made this decision the way a person makes a bet, with full knowledge that she might lose, but unable to make any other choice. Silas Boone owned the livery stable at the north end of Main Street. He'd bought it at 25 with money saved over 6 years of working other men's horses, and he'd run it since with a thoroughness that people in Blackridge had come to take for granted the way they took for granted a good winter supply of firewood. You only noticed it when it wasn't there. He was 30 years old now, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a man lean, with dark hair that he kept pushing back from his forehead and brown eyes that were steady and careful. He had a scar across his left hand from a wire fence accident when he was 19, and he'd broken his nose once in a fight he hadn't started and hadn't won, which had left it with a slight offset that somehow made his face look more honest rather than less. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He did not own land in the hundreds of acres or cattle in the hundreds of head. He had a stable, a house attached to the back of it that was 3 rooms and a loft, a good reputation, and the respect of essentially everyone who had ever done business with him, which in a town like Blackridge amounted to more than it might sound. Children brought him injured animals because they trusted him to fix them. Ranchers trusted him with their best horses. When 2 men had a dispute in Blackridge and needed someone to arbitrate who wasn't the sheriff and wasn't a lawyer, sometimes they came to Silas, and somehow the disputes got resolved. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good man, an honest man, the kind of man a woman could build a life with. He was also, by his own private assessment, a man with a stable and a broken nose and no particular reason to think that Evelyn Mercer, who could have had anyone in the county, would want him. The thing about being in love with someone who doesn't know it is that you develop habits. Evelyn's habits had accumulated over 4 years into an architecture so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She knew that Silas came into the store every other Thursday for his supplies. She knew he took his coffee black, which she'd learned from overhearing him at the Miners' Rest Saloon one afternoon. He'd ordered it without thinking, the automatic order of a man who'd made the same choice 1,000 times. She knew that he was gentle with animals in a way that some men were only gentle with things that could hurt them back, and that this was not that. It was something else, something more fundamental to who he was. She knew he'd had one serious courtship a few years back with a woman named Clara Whitmore, who'd come west with her family and then moved on with them 18 months later when the family's homestead failed. She knew he hadn't courted anyone since. She didn't know what to make of that exactly. She knew that when he came into the store on Thursdays, he always said thank you when she handed him his order, and that the way he said it, not reflexively but with a pause that suggested he actually meant it, was the kind of small detail that had lodged itself in her chest and stayed there. What she didn't know was what to do about any of it. Because the problem with loving a man who didn't know was that you couldn't make him know without risking everything. You couldn't just say it. Not in 1883 in Wyoming, not a woman, not without turning yourself into something vulnerable and exposed in a way that the frontier did not generally reward. And so she waited, and she turned down Robert Calloway and his velvet box, and she entered numbers in her father's ledger, and she hoped that somehow Silas Boone would figure it out on his own. She was starting to understand that hope, without action, was just another word for waiting. The morning after Robert's proposal, Evelyn was up before 5. She did this sometimes when she couldn't sleep, pulled on her clothes in the gray pre-dawn dark, and went down to the store to count things that didn't need counting, to write letters that could have waited, to do the quiet work of maintaining a life that felt lately slightly out of alignment with what she actually wanted. The store smelled of coffee beans and tobacco and dried herbs, and the particular woody smell of the pine planks her father had used for the shelves. She'd grown up in this smell. It was as much a part of her as her own name. She was going through the bolts of calico when she heard the door. She'd forgotten to lock it in the early dark, and turned to find her father standing in the doorway in his suspenders and his work shirt, not yet dressed for the day. "Heard you moving around," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He came in, went to the small iron stove in the corner, and started working on the fire. His hands were older than the rest of him somehow, weathered and deliberate. "Robert Calloway came to see me yesterday evening." "I know," Evelyn said. "He asked me first." "That was the proper order." "He was decent about it. Said you turned him down." "I did." Her father got the fire going and stood up and looked at her in the way he had. Not accusing, not demanding, just looking, in that way that meant he was trying to understand something and being careful about it. "You want to tell me why?" "Because I don't love him." "Evelyn." He said her name gently, not as a reprimand, more like a word he was handling carefully. "Robert Calloway is a good man." "I know he is." "You know I'm not trying to push you toward anything." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the town was beginning its slow morning sounds. Someone's dog, the distant clank of the blacksmith starting his day early. "It's just, and tell me if this is none of my business, it seems like there might be someone specific that's keeping you from saying yes to these men." Evelyn set down the bolt of calico she was holding. She turned and looked at her father. He raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "None of my business," he said. "I heard myself and I know. None of my business." "It's fine," she said. "You're not wrong. There is someone." He waited. "He doesn't know," she said. Her father nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was hearing news that confirmed a thing he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. "Well," he said after a moment, "is he a decent man?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "He's a very decent man." "Then maybe he deserves to know." She picked up the calico again. "Maybe," she said, but she didn't say anything else about it, and her father, who understood the limits of his own wisdom in certain areas, didn't push. Silas Boone woke that same morning at 5:15, which was when he always woke, and lay in the dim of his small bedroom for about 2 minutes before getting up, because 2 minutes was all he permitted himself before the day required him. He pulled on his boots and his work clothes and went out into the stable to start the morning feeding. He had 14 horses in his care right now, 7 boarded, 4 belonging to ranchers whose animals he was treating for various things, and 3 of his own. He knew each one by its habits as well as by its name. He worked in the quiet and the half-dark and the smell of hay and horse and morning, and somewhere in the middle of it, the way thoughts arrive without announcement when your hands are busy, he thought about Evelyn Mercer. He did this more often than he would have admitted to anyone. He thought about the way she'd handled herself when old Jim Taggart had come into the store last winter drunk and aggressive, demanding credit he hadn't earned. She'd spoken to him with a kind of calm authority that had diffused the whole thing without drama, which was remarkable because Jim Taggart drunk and aggressive was not something most people could manage. He thought about the way she laughed sometimes, sudden and a little surprised, like she hadn't been expecting to find something funny. He thought about the crooked line of her nose and how it was one of those imperfections that made a face more real somehow. He thought about these things and then he stopped himself, the way he always stopped himself, with a wall of practical reasoning that had grown thick and sturdy over the years. She was Thomas Mercer's daughter. She had half the county's eligible men pursuing her. She was educated and capable and admired, and she moved through the world with a surety that Silas, who had built everything he owned with his hands and his patience, recognized as something earned, something that came from a person knowing who they were and not doubting it much. She was Evelyn Mercer, and he was the man who ran the livery stable. And there was a gap between those two things that he could not quite measure because he wasn't sure exactly where it started or where it ended, only that it was there. He finished the morning feeding and went to heat water for coffee. And he put Evelyn Mercer out of his mind with the practiced discipline of a man who has learned that some things don't benefit from examination. He was good at this. He'd had years of practice. But the social life of Blackridge, such as it was, organized itself around a fairly predictable calendar of events. There were the Sunday services, which were more social than spiritual for most of the congregation. There were the occasional traveling shows that came through. A medicine show, once a year if they were lucky, a theatrical troupe from Denver the summer before last that had performed a melodrama of questionable quality to an audience of 250 people who'd traveled from surrounding ranches and homesteads just to see it. There were dances at the town hall, 4 or 5 a year, which were the closest thing Blackridge had to a formal social occasion. There was also the weekly gathering at the Miners' Rest on Saturday evenings, which was less formal and more useful for actually knowing what was happening in people's lives. It was at one of these Saturday gatherings, about a week after Robert Calloway's proposal, that Evelyn first became aware of a shift in the social weather. She was there with her friend Agnes Tully, who was 28 and married to a cattle buyer and had, in Evelyn's estimation, one of the more sensible marriages she'd observed. A partnership between two people who genuinely liked each other, which was more than you could say for some. Agnes was sharp and funny and had a low tolerance for pretension, which was part of why Evelyn valued her. They were sitting at a table near the back with 2 cups of coffee when Agnes leaned forward with the particular expression she wore when she had information worth delivering. "You heard about Gideon Ashcroft?" Agnes said. "I know who Gideon Ashcroft is," Evelyn said. "I don't know what about him." Gideon Ashcroft was, by some calculations, the wealthiest man in the county. He ran a cattle operation that stretched across more land than Evelyn had ever personally traveled across, employed something like 40 men, and had a house outside of town that people called a house, but that was, by any reasonable description, something closer to a mansion. He was 43 years old, widowed 3 years ago, with a reputation for being decisive to the point of bluntness and forgetting what he decided he wanted. He'd been living somewhat quietly since his wife died, which was to say he'd been present in the county's business affairs, but not in its social ones, until recently. "He's been asking about you," Agnes said. Evelyn set her coffee cup down. "Asking how?" "The kind of asking that's preliminary to something more formal." Agnes gave her a look that was somewhere between sympathetic and matter-of-fact. "He talked to Douglas at the land office. Douglas told me. He was asking about your father's standing, business-wise. The kind of questions a man asks when he's thinking about approaching a woman's father." "He hasn't spoken to me," Evelyn said. "Not beyond passing pleasantries." "He's being careful about it. He's that kind of man. Doesn't move until he's thought it through." Agnes paused. "Evelyn, Gideon Ashcroft is not Robert Calloway. He's not going to take no the same way. He's not going to fold it up and put it back in his pocket and walk out the door. He's persistent. He's used to getting what he wants. I'm used to telling men no. I know you are. But this one might be different." Agnes wasn't being dramatic about it. She was being factual in the way she was factual about most things. "And your father? How is your father?" Evelyn looked at her. "What do you mean?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "The Simmons account," she said carefully. "Douglas mentioned that too. I'm not trying to get into your business. I'm asking because I care about you. The Simmons account." Evelyn kept her face still. The Simmons account was a debt that Harlan Simmons, one of the largest buyers her father supplied, had been slow to pay on, significantly slow, in a way that had created a pressure on the store's cash flow that her father was managing carefully and not discussing. Evelyn managed the books. She knew what was there and what wasn't. She knew that Gideon Ashcroft was also one of Harlan Simmons' largest creditors, which meant that if Ashcroft chose to, he could influence the Simmons account in either direction. She picked up her coffee cup. "It's fine," she said. "Everything is fine." Agnes looked at her with the expression of a woman who knew when a friend was not being fully honest, but also knew when to let it alone. Thomas Mercer told her himself 2 days later. He came into the back office where she was doing the accounts, sat down across from her, and folded his hands on the desk in the way he did when he had something difficult to say. "Gideon Ashcroft came to see me this morning," he said. Evelyn kept her pen in her hand. "What did he say?" "He was direct about it. He respects you. He thinks you're capable and sensible, his words. He said he believes you'd be well suited and that he would see to it that you'd want for nothing. Her father paused. He's going to come and speak to you himself. He asked my permission to do so. I told him that was your decision to make, not mine. Good. He's a serious man, Evelyn. I know he is. And the Simmons situation, I know about the Simmons situation. Her father looked at her steadily. I'm not saying that should factor into your decision. I want to be clear about that. What I'm saying is, I know you've been waiting for something, someone, and I'm asking you, with love and not with pressure, whether whatever you're waiting for is going to arrive before the situation gets more complicated. Evelyn looked at the numbers in the ledger in front of her. Numbers were honest. They told you exactly where you stood if you were willing to look. I don't know, she said. Evelyn, I don't know, Papa. Her voice was even, but her chest felt tight in a way she didn't like. I need you to give me a little time. He stood up. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the most physical affection he was usually capable of, and then he left her alone with the ledger. She sat there for a long time after he was gone, looking at the numbers. Then she closed the ledger, put on her hat, and went for a walk. Well, she walked north on Main Street without particularly deciding to, which meant she ended up, as she sometimes did, near the livery stable. The wide doors were open to the spring afternoon, the way Silas kept them when the weather allowed it. She could see him inside, working on something near the back, a harness, from the look of it, spread across the work table. He was bent over it with that focused stillness he had when his hands were occupied with something that required precision, a quality of concentration that she'd always found. She didn't let herself use the word beautiful, exactly, but something adjacent to it. She stopped on the boardwalk across the street. He hadn't seen her. She could keep walking. She could go home and have her quiet crisis in private, the way she'd been having it for the past 4 years. Instead, she stood there, which was something. A boy from the Hendricks farm came running down the street and nearly collided with her, muttering an apology without slowing. From inside the stable, one of the horses made a sound of mild complaint, and Silas said something to it. She couldn't hear the words from across the street, just the tone of it, low and settling. Evelyn turned around and walked home. The social geography of Blackridge meant that avoiding someone and regularly seeing them were not easily distinguished from each other. The town was not large enough for clean avoidance, so Silas Boone continued to come into the store every other Thursday, and Evelyn continued to hand him his order, and they continued their Thursday interaction with the careful naturalness of people performing a version of normal, so practiced it had almost become real. Almost. How's the chestnut filly doing? Evelyn asked one Thursday in late April. The Hendricks family had left their young horse with Silas 2 weeks ago after she'd thrown a shoe badly and damaged the hoof. Silas looked up from signing the receipt. He had a habit of being slightly surprised when someone asked about his work in that particular way. Not the casual what's going on with such and such horse, but the specific question that showed they'd been paying attention. Good, he said. Better than I expected, honestly. Young Hendricks was worried she'd be lame, but the hoof's growing back clean. That's good news for them. Yeah, he handed back the receipt. You know horses? My grandfather had a few. I spent summers with him when I was small. She paused. I remember thinking that the way you could tell whether someone was decent was by how they treated horses. My grandfather said that. Silas looked at her for a moment in that steady way he had. Your grandfather sounds like he was smart. He was, Evelyn said. Stubborn as anything, but smart. It was the longest conversation they'd had in a while. It lasted maybe 3 minutes. After he left, Evelyn stood at the counter and thought about how much she had not said, and how heavy the not saying was getting. It was a man named Frank Aldridge who changed things, though not in the way anyone would have predicted. Frank was Silas's oldest friend. They'd known each other since they were boys in Missouri, before each of them had made their own way west. He was 40 now, with a wife and 3 children and a homestead 12 miles east of Blackridge, and he came into town once a month or so to resupply and to see Silas. And on these visits, the two of them would sit on the bench outside the stable in the evenings and talk in the easy way of men who have known each other long enough that silence between them is comfortable. Frank was perceptive in the way that quiet men sometimes are. He'd had a lot of practice watching the world without inserting himself into it, and this had given him a quality of observation that most people didn't notice until it was directed at them. He'd been noticing things in Blackridge for the past year or so. On a Thursday evening in early May, the two of them were sitting on the bench outside the stable, watching the street go quiet as the day wound down, when Frank said, without any particular preamble, "You know Evelyn Mercer's turned down another proposal." Silas was whittling something, not for any particular purpose, just for the occupation of it. He didn't look up. "Calloway," he said. "I heard." 7 proposals, Frank said. "In 2 years, that's some kind of record. She knows what she wants, I guess." Frank looked at him sideways. "You really don't know." Silas looked up. "Don't know what?" Frank was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was deciding something. He'd been deciding it for a while, actually, since the winter before, since the Quilting Circle dinner where his wife had spoken to Agnes Tully, and Agnes had said certain things that had rearranged Frank's understanding of the situation in Blackridge considerably. "Silas," Frank said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it properly, which means I need you not to dismiss it the way you dismiss things you don't want to think about." Silas stopped whittling. He set the piece of wood down on the bench beside him and looked at his oldest friend. "Go ahead," he said. "She's been waiting for you," Frank said. "Evelyn Mercer. The reason she keeps saying no to every man in this county is because none of them are you." The street was quiet. Somewhere down toward the saloon, someone was playing something on a badly tuned instrument. Silas stared at his friend. "Agnes Tully told my wife," Frank said, "which means it came from a reliable place, not from gossip. Evelyn's never said it outright to anyone. She's too careful for that. But she hasn't exactly hidden it from people who pay attention either. Agnes has been watching this for 2 years, and she's certain." Silas said nothing. His face was doing something complicated. "She chose you," Frank said. "She just chose you without telling you, which is her own particular way of handling things, I suppose. And now you've got Gideon Ashcroft circling, and her father's got business pressures that Ashcroft could make worse or better. And the window you've been assuming was open indefinitely is, Silas, it's not indefinitely." Silas stood up from the bench. He walked a few steps out into the street and stood there with his back to Frank, looking at nothing in particular. Frank waited. "She could have anyone," Silas said to the empty street. His voice was quiet and not entirely steady. "I know. Ashcroft, the Calloway Ranch, any of them." "I know. She doesn't want any of them." Silas turned around. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just been handed information that is reorganizing everything he thought he understood about his own life. "You're telling me that she... for 4 years? More or less, yes." "Frank, if you're wrong about this..." "I've known you since we were 10 years old," Frank said. "I'm not wrong. And even if there were any doubt about it, wouldn't you rather know? Wouldn't you rather ask and get the honest answer than keep standing across the street, watching that woman turn down every man who isn't you?" The badly tuned instrument continued its work down at the saloon. The evening was settling in cool and blue over the rooftops of Blackridge. Silas stood in the street for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I've been an idiot." "For about 4 years, yes," Frank agreed without particular judgment. Silas looked at his friend. Something had shifted in his face, the complicated expression resolving into something simpler and more frightened, and somehow, underneath that, more alive. "She might still say no," he said. "Knowing what you're telling me, she could have, I don't know, changed her mind. I'm not..." "Silas," Frank said, "go find out." "What?" "He didn't go that night. He wasn't ready that night. He lay awake in his 3-room house behind the stable and looked at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct the past 4 years through this new lens, which was disorienting in the way that any significant reorientation is disorienting. Like looking at a landscape you've walked through 100 times and suddenly realizing the mountain you thought was north is actually east. The Thursdays, her question about the filly, the small things she'd said and done that he'd cataloged without understanding why he was cataloging them. He thought about the day she'd come to find him when her father's delivery horse had gotten loose in the early morning and ended up tangled in old Hendricks's fence. She'd come to him first, not the sheriff, not any of the other men in town. Him. He'd assumed it was because the stable was close, because he was the obvious person to ask about a horse. Maybe it hadn't only been that. He got up at 3 in the morning and went out to sit with his horses, which was something he did sometimes when his mind wouldn't quiet. He sat on an overturned bucket in the dark and listened to them breathing and thought about courage, or the lack of it, and about the specific species of fool that spends years afraid of something that might have been his all along. By morning, he had decided. So, the decision didn't make things simple. It wasn't the kind of decision that resolved into a clear plan. He knew what he had to do. He had to talk to Evelyn, actually talk to her, not the Thursday transaction talk, but the real kind. And the knowing didn't make it less terrifying. He was, by nature, a man who thought carefully before acting. This had served him well in most areas of his life. It had not served him well in this one. He spent the day working and thinking, which meant the horses got groomed to a standard somewhat above their usual because his hands needed something to do. He thought about what he would say and discarded version after version. The versions that were too formal, the versions that were too casual and made it sound like nothing was at stake. The version that started with, "I think I may have made a significant error in judgment regarding my feelings for you over a period of approximately 4 years, which was honest, but not exactly what the moment called for. In the end, what he understood was that there wasn't a right set of words that would make this safe. There was no version of saying what he needed to say that didn't require him to walk out onto uncertain ground without any guarantee about what he'd find there. He'd built a stable. He'd built a business. He'd done hard things. He'd just never done a hard thing that scared him quite this much. That evening, after he'd locked up and fed the horses and stood in the doorway of his small house looking at the last light on the mountains, he thought about Evelyn Mercer waiting. 4 years of waiting. Turning down men she didn't love, sitting with a ledger that had pressure in it that a man like Gideon Ashcroft could influence. He thought about Frank saying, "The window you've been assuming was open indefinitely is not indefinitely." He thought about what it would mean if he waited one more day and one more after that, until the waiting itself became the decision. He didn't sleep well, but in the morning he put on his good shirt, which he hardly ever wore, and he walked toward town. Evelyn was in the store. She was where she usually was on a weekday morning, behind the counter with the ledger, the store quiet around her in the way it was quiet before the day really got started. The door was open. The morning light came in yellow and low and fell across the pine floors in a way that was actually beautiful, though she wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about numbers and about Gideon Ashcroft, who had sent a note the day before requesting the honor of speaking with her that Saturday. She had not yet decided how to respond to the note. She heard the bell above the door and looked up. Silas Boone was standing in the doorway. He was wearing his good shirt, which she noticed, and his hat was in his hands rather than on his head, which she also noticed. He had the expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and has committed to the decision, but hasn't yet gotten past the terror of it. "Silas," she said, "it's not Thursday." "No," he said, "it's not." He came into the store. He stopped a few feet from the counter. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes that weren't quite steady right now. "I need to talk to you, if you've got a minute." "I've got a minute," she said. She came around from behind the counter and crossed to the door and turned the sign to closed and then stood there looking at him. "Go ahead." He looked at the hat in his hands. Then he looked at her. "I talked to Frank last night," he said. "He told me something. I don't know if it's true. I'm hoping you'll tell me if it is." He stopped. He started again. "For the past 4 years, I've had feelings for you that I kept to myself because I couldn't imagine because it seemed like a kind of foolishness to think that you might." He stopped again. Evelyn stood very still. "I should have said something a long time ago," Silas said. "I know that. I'm saying it now because I heard about Ashcroft and about your father's situation, and I didn't want to let another day go by where I was waiting for something to make it feel less risky, because I don't think that day is coming." He finally met her eyes directly. "Evelyn, I love you. I have loved you for years, and I've been too much of a coward to say so. I'm saying it now." The store was quiet around them. Outside, the street was starting its morning sounds. Evelyn looked at him. The good shirt, the hat in his hands, the slight offset of his broken nose, the 4 years of Thursday mornings, and the weight of everything that hadn't been said. and she felt something release in her chest, like a thing she'd been holding onto that was now, finally, set down. "Silas Boone," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady either. "I have been waiting for you to say that for 4 years." He stared at her. "I turned down 7 men," she said. 7 good men, because none of them were you. I have been sitting here turning down everyone who asked because I was waiting for you to figure out what I knew since I was 22 years old. She felt her eyes sting and blinked it back because she was not going to cry in the first 5 minutes of this. "You are not a coward. You're one of the most solid people I know. You're just—" She made a small, frustrated sound. "Slow. You are very slow." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell. His eyes were bright. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize," she said. "Just don't make me wait anymore." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his hat down on the nearest shelf, which happened to be the one with the tobacco tins, and he crossed the few feet between them. "I won't," he said. Outside, the morning continued its ordinary business. The clank of the blacksmith, the sound of horses, the distant call of someone's name. And inside the store, 4 years of silence finally ended. It was not a perfect moment. The tobacco tins were an undignified resting place for his hat. Her ledger was open on the counter behind her with numbers in it that still needed addressing. She had flour on her sleeve from the morning's work. Again, because flour in her sleeves had a relationship she'd never successfully resolved. But his hands, when he took hers, were the hands of a man who had worked for everything he had and knew the difference between what mattered and what didn't. And hers, in his, finally felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The sign on the door said closed for 45 minutes. When Evelyn finally turned it back to open, her hair was slightly less tidy than it had been, and there was a look on her face that Agnes Tully, who happened to be passing on the boardwalk at that precise moment, recognized immediately, because Agnes Tully had been married for 6 years and knew what a woman looked like when something she'd wanted for a long time had finally arrived. Agnes stopped walking. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the tobacco tins on the shelf behind the counter, where a man's hat was still resting at an angle that suggested it had been set down in a hurry. Then she looked at Evelyn again. "Well," Agnes said. "Don't," Evelyn said, but she was smiling. "I'm not saying a word." "Good. Not a single word." Agnes came into the store and sat down on the stool near the door that was technically for customers who needed to rest their feet. "Was it Silas?" Evelyn picked up her ledger and opened it to where she'd left off. "I'm not discussing this." "It was Silas," Agnes said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose patience had finally been rewarded. "Agnes Tully, you brilliant woman." She said this quietly, to herself, but not so quietly that Evelyn couldn't hear it. "You knew," Evelyn said. "I suspected. For about a year." Agnes folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't say anything because I thought you'd handle it in your own time, and also because I valued our friendship and I knew you'd be irritated with me if I pushed." "I would have been irritated with you." "I know." Agnes paused. Did it go well?" Evelyn looked at her ledger. The numbers were the same numbers they'd been an hour ago. The Simmons account was still what it was. The note from Gideon Ashcroft was still on the shelf where she'd put it. "Yes," she said. "It went well." Agnes nodded once in a way that managed to contain a significant amount of restrained celebration. Then, because she was a practical woman who understood that happiness and complications were not mutually exclusive, she said, "What about Ashcroft?" The question settled in the room. "I haven't answered his note," Evelyn said. "You'll need to." "I know I'll need to." She set the ledger down. "I'll handle it." Agnes looked at her with an expression that was affectionate and also slightly worried, because Agnes understood Gideon Ashcroft better than Evelyn did. Her husband did business with him, which meant she'd been in the same room as the man on several occasions and had formed opinions about him that were not uncomplicated. "Be careful," Agnes said, "with how you handle it. He doesn't respond to things the way Robert Calloway does. He doesn't fold the box up and walk out." "Agnes," Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been saying no to men since I was 22. I'll be fine." Agnes left shortly after, and Evelyn stood in the quiet store and let herself have exactly 2 minutes of something uncomplicated, something warm and simple and light in her chest. before she picked up the note from Gideon Ashcroft and read it again. The handwriting was precise. Everything about the note was precise. He requested the honor of a conversation at her convenience on a matter of personal importance. He expressed his respect for her and for her family. He closed with the kind of formal courtesy that people use when they are trying to be both polite and unmistakable about their intentions at the same time. She folded the note and put it back on the shelf. Then she opened the ledger and made herself look at the numbers again, which was what the situation required. The Simmons account was 42 days overdue. Her father had been patient about it because Harlan Simmons was a long-standing customer and because the winter had been hard on everyone's cash position. But the store had its own suppliers to pay, and the slack in the line was getting tight, not disastrously tight. Thomas Mercer had not built his business on careless credit, but tight enough that a continued delay would require decisions she didn't want her father to have to make. And Gideon Ashcroft, as she knew and as Agnes had implied and as Agnes's husband probably knew better than either of them, was in a position to influence Harlan Simmons's payment priorities in one direction or the other. He hadn't said so. He would never say so directly. But it was there in the situation the way things were there in water, but you couldn't see them, but you could feel the current. She was not going to marry Gideon Ashcroft. She was going to have to be very careful about how she said so. Silas arrived at the stable that morning to find Frank sitting on the bench outside with his arms crossed and the expression of a man waiting for a report. "Well," Frank said. Silas unlocked the stable door. He didn't say anything for a moment. He went in and started the late morning checks, moving through the stalls with the focused routine of it. Frank followed him in and leaned against the wall near the door, waiting. "You were right," Silas said finally. Frank let out a breath. "She told you?" "She told me I was slow." Silas stopped at the Chestnut Filly's stall and checked the hoof, running his hand along it with the practiced attention he gave everything. The hoof was good, clean. 4 years slow was sort of the implication. "She's not wrong." "No." Silas straightened up. He had an expression that Frank hadn't seen on him in a long time. Maybe since they were young men, before the hard years had settled into him. Something easier, something less armored. "She said she'd been waiting." "I know," Frank said. "I told you." "You told me, and I still walked over there thinking there was a reasonable chance I'd walk back alone." Silas moved to the next stall. I'm still working out how I managed to miss it for 4 years." "You talked yourself out of it," Frank said. "Every time you got close to seeing it, you reminded yourself of all the reasons it wasn't possible, and then you went back to believing the reasons. That's what people do." He paused. "What are you going to do about Ashcroft?" Silas's jaw tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the man sent her a note asking to speak with her. Douglas at the land office told me this morning. Ashcroft came back in yesterday asking follow-up questions. He's moving." Frank pushed himself off the wall. "He doesn't know what happened this morning. As far as he knows, the field is still open." "I know." Silas was quiet for a moment, working with his hands because it helped him think. I'm not going to go confront the man over a woman who hasn't been asked anything by him yet. I'm not doing it that way." "Good," Frank said, "because that would be a mistake." "I'm aware. But you should know that Ashcroft doesn't slow down once he's decided. He's that kind of man." "I know what kind of man he is," Silas said. There was an edge in his voice that Frank noticed and chose not to press. "I'm not worried about Ashcroft. Evelyn knows her own mind. She always has." Frank nodded. He looked at his oldest friend and thought about what he was seeing. The difference in a man who has been holding something back for years and then finally set it down. The posture was different. The steadiness was the same, but it was carrying something lighter now. "I'm glad you went this morning," Frank said. Silas looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The note Evelyn sent to Gideon Ashcroft that afternoon was short. She thanked him for his kind words and expressed that she would be happy to speak with him, and named Saturday morning at the store as a suitable time. She kept it formal, and she kept it brief, and she walked it to the post office herself rather than sending it by the boy who sometimes ran errands for the store because she didn't want the contents discussed before Saturday. Her father found her in the back office that evening when she was locking up. "Silas Boone came to see you today," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. In Blackridge, you couldn't turn a sign to closed at 10 in the morning without people noticing. Yes, Evelyn said. And? She looked at her father. He was 61 years old, and his hair had gone completely white in the past 2 years. And he was trying very hard to keep his expression neutral, which meant he was failing at it in the small ways that neutral fails when a person actually cares about the answer. He told me he loves me, she said. I told him I've loved him for years. We're going to spend some time together and do this properly. Thomas Mercer's neutral expression did not survive this information. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and something warmer underneath it. He nodded once, twice, the way he nodded when he was processing something he'd actually been hoping to hear. He's a good man, Thomas said. He is. I've always thought well of Silas Boone. I know, Papa. He cleared his throat. And Ashcroft? I've arranged to speak with him Saturday. Evelyn, I know what I'm doing. He looked at her for a long moment. I know you do, he said finally. I'm not worried about that. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I just don't want you to go into that conversation thinking it's going to be simple. I don't think anything is simple, Evelyn said. I've been managing your accounts for 4 years. I know exactly how simple things are. Thomas put his hat on. All right, he said. All right. At the door he stopped. For what it's worth, I would have found another way to manage the Simmons situation. Whatever happened with you, I want you to know that. She looked at him. I know, she said, and she meant it. And she also knew that the other way would have been harder on him than he was letting on, and that his saying it was an act of love regardless of what was true. He left. She finished locking up and went home and made supper and ate it at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house, and thought about Saturday. Gideon Ashcroft arrived at the store at 9 on the dot Saturday morning. He was the kind of man for whom punctuality was a form of control. It meant you were never the one who had to wait, never the one who arrived into a situation already in progress, never the one who had to catch up. He was tall, well-built for a man in his 40s, with iron gray hair and a face that had the look of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that other people had to live with. He was wearing his good coat, not his working one, which Evelyn noted and filed away. He had the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to being the most substantial person in any room he entered. He looked around the store when he came in, not the look of a man who was interested in dry goods, but the look of a man who was assessing context. He took in the shelves, the counter, the setup of it. He had the manner of a man who always knew where he was. Miss Mercer, he said, thank you for agreeing to see me. Mr. Ashcroft. She was behind the counter, which she had decided deliberately. It was her ground. Good morning. He came to stand at the counter and folded his hands on top of it in a way that was relaxed and confident and slightly territorial, as if the counter were a thing he could claim a share of by touching it. I'll be direct, he said. I believe that's what you'd prefer. Generally, yes. I've admired you for some time. I think you're a capable and intelligent woman, and I believe we would suit each other well. I'm prepared to make a serious offer of marriage, with your father's blessing, and I want to give you the opportunity to consider it before I do. He looked at her steadily. I know you've turned down other men. I'm not other men. Evelyn looked at him. He wasn't wrong about that. He wasn't like Robert Calloway or any of the others. There was a weight to him, a deliberateness, and she could understand why people found it compelling. She could also see very clearly what Agnes had meant about him not folding the box up and walking out. I appreciate your directness, she said, and I'll be equally direct. I'm flattered by your regard, Mr. Ashcroft, genuinely, but my answer is no. He didn't flinch. He didn't change expression exactly, but something shifted in his eyes. A recalibration. May I ask why? Because my heart is elsewhere, she said. It has been for some time. I don't think that's going to change. A pause. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding whether the answer he'd been given was the real answer or a preliminary position. She could see him doing this, the assessment, the weighing. I heard about Silas Boone coming to see you Thursday, he said. She kept her face level. Of course he'd heard. Then you have your answer, she said. Something moved across his face that wasn't anger exactly, but was in the family of anger, something controlled and cold and pointed. "Silas Boone runs a livery stable," he said. His voice stayed even. "He's a decent man, I'll grant you that. But he can't give you—" "Mr. Ashcroft." Her voice was quiet, and she kept it that way. "I understand what you're offering, and I'm telling you respectfully that what you can give me isn't what I want. That's my answer, and I don't believe it's going to change." He looked at her for a long moment. The store was very quiet. Outside, the Saturday street was picking up its usual noise: horses, voices, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business. "The Simmons account," he said. Just that. 2 words. She met his eyes. "What about it?" "Harlan Simmons owes me a significant amount of money," Ashcroft said. "I'm in a position to affect his priorities in various ways." "I'm aware of that," Evelyn said. "I'm not threatening you," he said, and there was a specific quality to the way he said it. The quality of a man stating a fact about himself that he believed regardless of how it sounded. "I want to be clear about that. I'm simply noting the situation." "I understand the situation," she said, "and I appreciate you being clear about it." She held his gaze. "My answer is still no." Another long silence. He was, she realized, not accustomed to this, not to the particular quality of no that she was giving him. Not apologetic, not tentative, not looking for a way to soften the edges of it. Just no, held steadily, without giving ground. He straightened up from the counter. He put his hat back on. "I respect your decision," he said, in a tone that suggested the respect was real, even if the situation wasn't what he'd expected. "I hope things go well for you, Miss Mercer." "Thank you," she said. "I hope the same for you." He left, and the bell above the door chimed twice in that familiar way, and Evelyn stood at the counter and let herself breathe. Her hands, when she looked at them, were perfectly steady. She noted this with something that wasn't pride exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. She'd said no. The question was what he'd do about it. She didn't have to wait long to find out. By Tuesday, it became clear that the Simmons account was not going to resolve on its own timetable. Harlan Simmons sent a note, apologetic, vague, requesting additional time. The kind of note a man sends when someone with leverage over him has applied that leverage in a quiet way that he doesn't want to name directly. Thomas Mercer brought her the note on Tuesday afternoon. He read it and said nothing for a moment, and then he set it down on the desk between them. "It's going to be a while longer," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'll need to look at what we can shift." He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture of tiredness more than worry, the gesture of a man who has managed problems before and knows the shape of managing them. "It's not unsurvivable. It'll be uncomfortable for a bit." "I know." She looked at the note. "Papa, I need to tell you something." He looked at her. "Ashcroft mentioned the Simmons account," she said, "when he came Saturday. He didn't threaten me. He was careful about how he said it. But he said it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. His face went through something and then settled into something resolved. "And you said no anyway?" "I said no anyway?" He nodded slowly. "Then we'll manage the Simmons situation on our own," he said. "The way we manage things." He stood up. "I'm not angry, Evelyn. I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry. I know. I'd rather cut expenses for 6 months than have you—" He stopped. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. He went to the door and then stopped. "Does Silas know about this? About the Simmons situation?" "No," Evelyn said. "And I don't want him to. Not right now. I don't want him thinking he needs to do something about it. This is our business, our family's business." Thomas looked at her with an expression she'd seen all her life, the expression he wore when she reminded him of her mother in a way he hadn't expected. "All right," he said. "All right." What neither of them knew was that Silas already knew, not from Evelyn and not from Thomas. He knew because Frank's wife had told Frank, and Frank had a limit to how much information he could keep from his oldest friend when that information was directly relevant to the woman Silas loved. Silas found out on Wednesday evening, and he sat with it for the better part of an hour. Sat in the stable with the horses, and the quiet and the particular anger of a man who has found out that someone he cares about is being made to pay a price for a decision that had nothing to do with her business and everything to do with his. The anger was clean. That was the word for it. Not wild, not the kind that makes a man do something stupid. Just clean and cold and focused, the way anger is when it's about something real rather than something personal. He thought about going to Ashcroft directly and talked himself out of it in about 4 minutes, because confronting the man would accomplish nothing useful and might make things worse for Evelyn and for Thomas, who didn't need a scene on their behalf. He thought about what he could actually do, which was the more useful question. He was still thinking about it when 2 days later Evelyn came to see him. She came on Friday afternoon, which was not a Thursday and was therefore not their usual territory. She came in through the wide stable doors and found him at the work table with a length of leather harness and a needle, doing repair work that required his glasses, which she'd never seen him wear before. They were small wireframe things that sat slightly crooked on his nose, and the fact that she found this detail completely disarming told her something about herself that she already knew. "You wear glasses," she said. He looked up and took them off with a speed that was purely reflexive, and then seemed to realize that was a strange response to an observation. He put them back on. "For close work," he said. "I can see fine at a distance." "I know," she said. "I'm not making fun." He looked at her. "Is everything all right?" "I wanted to tell you something," she said. She came further into the stable, into the smell of hay and horse and leather, and the sound of the animals doing their patient stable things. "About the situation with Ashcroft." "Frank told me," Silas said. She stopped. "Frank told you what?" "About the Simmons account. About what Ashcroft said to you." He set the harness down. He took the glasses off again, more slowly this time, and folded them. "I'm not angry at you for not telling me. I understand why you didn't." She looked at him. "I didn't want you thinking you needed to do something." "I know." He stood up. "And I'm not going to go do something dramatic. I want you to know that. I'm not going to go confront the man and make it worse." He paused. "But I've been thinking about the Simmons account." "Silas, I have some savings," he said. "I've been thinking about expanding the stable anyway. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, actually. There's a parcel of land on the north end that I've been watching. If I were to move on it now, I'd need to deal with the Cheyenne Bank, and the Cheyenne Bank's regional officer is James Whitfield, who I've done business with and who is not connected to Ashcroft's interests." He looked at her steadily. "And James Whitfield is also a large enough creditor in this county that Harlan Simmons would prioritize his recommendations over almost anyone else's." Evelyn stared at him. "You've been thinking about this since Wednesday." "Since Wednesday evening," he confirmed. "Silas, you'd be taking on debt, on land you may not even want right now." "I want it," he said. "I've wanted it for 2 years. The timing is just happening to be now." He said this in the straightforward way he said most things, without decoration. "I'm not doing it to rescue your father's account. I'm doing it because it makes sense for my business, and one of the consequences is that it puts a different kind of pressure on Harlan Simmons's priorities. Those two things happen to be true at the same time." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the stable doors and made the dust in the air visible, small particles moving in slow patterns, the way light always found what was otherwise invisible. "You could have told me," she said. "I'm telling you now." He came around the table. "I wanted to be sure it would actually work before I said anything. I spoke to Whitfield this morning by telegraph. He's interested." He stopped in front of her. "I also want to be clear. If your father tells me to stay out of it, I'll stay out of it. This is your family's business, and I'm not trying to take it over. I'm just trying to be useful, if that's all right." Evelyn looked at him. The glasses were still folded in his hand. He had a small smudge of leather oil on his left cheekbone that he didn't know was there. "It's all right," she said. He nodded once. "Good." He turned back toward the work table and then stopped. "For what it's worth, what you did with Ashcroft, saying no without moving, that took something." "I know what I want," she said. "It wasn't hard." He looked at her over his shoulder, and the look was the kind that she understood now was not something he gave to most people. Open and direct, and carrying the weight of what he hadn't been able to say for 4 years, but was learning to say now. "Me too," he said. Outside, the Friday afternoon went about its business. In the Miners' Rest and the quilting circles and the post office bench, the town of Blackridge was in the process of absorbing new information. Silas Boone had visited Evelyn Mercer on a Thursday that wasn't a supply day. The store had been closed for 45 minutes. The man had been seen in his good shirt. and Gideon Ashcroft had come out of the Mercer store on Saturday morning with an expression that people who knew his face well described as a man who had been told something he hadn't expected to be told. The town was not yet sure what to make of all this, but it was paying attention. And somewhere at the edge of everything, Gideon Ashcroft was sitting in his large house outside of town, doing what men like him did when something didn't go according to plan, deciding what came next. He was not the kind of man who had one move. The telegraph from James Whitfield came back on Monday morning, and it said yes. Silas read it twice, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and went back to work. He had a rancher's horse to shoe and 2 stalls to muck out, and a delivery of hay coming in the afternoon. And the fact that a significant financial decision had just been confirmed didn't change any of that. The work was still the work. He'd learned a long time ago that the world didn't pause for your pivotal moments. But he kept his hand on the folded telegraph in his pocket for most of the morning. The way you keep your hand on something you want to make sure is real. Frank came by at midday and Silas told him. Frank sat on the bench and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're taking on a lot." "I know." "The land and the expansion, and now this business with Whitfield and Simmons. I know what I'm taking on. I'm not saying it's wrong," Frank said. "I'm saying it's a lot for a man who, 3 weeks ago, couldn't work up the nerve to walk across the street." Silas looked at him. "Are you going to be useful, or are you going to sit there and recount my failures?" "I can try to do both," Frank offered, "then be useful first." Frank got up and helped him with the hay delivery, and they worked without talking much, which was one of the things Silas had always valued about Frank. The man understood that help didn't always require commentary. What Silas hadn't told Frank, what he hadn't told anyone yet, was that the Whitfield arrangement was only part of what he'd been thinking about. The land purchase, the expansion, those were real plans, things he'd genuinely been considering for 2 years. He wasn't lying about that. But sitting in the stable Wednesday night with the clean, cold anger about Ashcroft and the Simmons account, he'd also been sitting with something else, something larger. He'd been thinking about what it meant to actually be in Evelyn Mercer's life rather than adjacent to it. Being adjacent had been safe. You could care about someone from across the street and the caring cost you something, but it didn't cost you everything. You couldn't lose what you'd never formally claimed. He understood now. Frank had been right. He'd been managing the distance as a protection, and the protection had felt like wisdom when it was just fear wearing wisdom's coat. But Evelyn had said, "I've been waiting for you for 4 years." And that meant 4 years of watching him be afraid and choosing to wait anyway, which was a kind of faith in him that he wasn't sure he'd earned, which meant the only honest response was to become the man she'd been waiting for rather than the man who'd made her wait. He wasn't sure exactly how to do that. He was figuring it out. The first part of it was the Whitfield arrangement, which was practical and useful. The second part was harder to name. On Wednesday of that week, Evelyn came to find him again. This was becoming a pattern, her coming to the stable on days that weren't Thursdays, which felt significant to him in a way he didn't examine too directly because examining it would have made him smile like an idiot in the middle of a working day. She came in with a look on her face that he was starting to learn, the look she had when something had happened and she was still processing whether it was good or bad or some combination of the two. "Simmons sent a note to my father this morning," she said. "He's going to pay within the week." Silas nodded. He was working on the chestnut filly's hoof again. Follow-up maintenance, making sure the growth was continuing clean. He didn't look up immediately. "That's good news for your father, Silas." He looked up. "Whitfield contacted Simmons on Monday," she said. "The same day your telegraph came back confirmed." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a coincidence." "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. He went back to the hoof, and she came and sat on the stool near the filly's head, and the horse turned and regarded her with mild animal interest. "You should have told me you were going to do it," Evelyn said, "before you did it." "Would you have let me?" A pause. "Probably not. That's why I didn't tell you before." He set the hoof down gently and straightened. "I should have told you the same day I did it. That's fair." "Yes," she said, "it is." But her voice wasn't angry. It was something else. Something that was working through a feeling that was partly gratitude and partly the adjustment of accepting help from someone, which was not something Evelyn Mercer was practiced at. "I'm not going to do things behind your back as a habit," Silas said. "I want to be clear about that. This was a specific situation with a specific reason for the timing." "I know." She looked at the filly, who had apparently decided Evelyn was trustworthy and was now standing with her nose near Evelyn's shoulder. "Thank you," she said. "I don't say that easily." "I know you don't," Silas said. "That's why it means something when you do." They stayed like that for a few minutes, in the particular quiet of the stable in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, and it was the most natural thing and also the most new thing at the same time, which was, Silas thought, about the best description of where they were. Gideon Ashcroft did not disappear. This was not surprising. He was not a man who disappeared, but the form his continued presence took shifted in a way that was harder to address than open pressure. He stopped being directly relevant to the Simmons account. Whitfield had seen to that, but he began being present in other ways. Ways that were social rather than financial, and therefore more difficult to manage. He attended the Sunday service for 3 consecutive weeks, which he had not done since his wife's funeral. He was visible at the Saturday evening gathering at the Miners' Rest, where he spoke pleasantly to everyone and did nothing that could be pointed to as improper. He was courteous to Evelyn on the 2 occasions their paths crossed publicly. Too courteous, in the way of a man who is performing courtesy for an audience while communicating something else entirely to the person it's directed at. What he was communicating, Evelyn understood, was that he was still here, that he was patient, that he had resources she didn't and time she wasn't sure she had, and that he was willing to play a longer game than she might expect. Agnes confirmed this reading one Thursday afternoon when she came into the store and said, without preamble, "He's been talking to people about the land on the north end." Evelyn looked up from the counter. "What land?" "The parcel Silas is looking at." Agnes's face was carefully neutral, which meant she was worried. "He's been asking around, casually, the way he does things. He talked to the Hendricks boy about who'd been inquiring about it. He can't buy land out from under Silas just to—" Evelyn stopped. "He can," Agnes said. "That's exactly the kind of thing he can do." She paused. "I don't know that he's going to. I don't know that he's even seriously considering it. But he's asking questions, and when Gideon Ashcroft asks questions, it's usually because he's thinking about doing something with the answers." Evelyn set down what she'd been holding. She thought about Silas and the folded telegraph in his pocket, and the expansion plans he'd been carrying around for 2 years, and about what it would mean if Ashcroft moved on that land for no reason except to make things harder. "I need to talk to Silas," she said. "I thought you might," Agnes said. She went that evening, later than she usually would. The sun was getting low, and the street was quieting down from its afternoon business. Silas was outside the stable, sitting on the bench with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking like a man who had also been thinking about things. He'd heard already. Of course. This was Blackridge. "The land office boy told me this afternoon," he said, before she could say anything. "Ashcroft was in there Tuesday asking about the parcel. Agnes told me today." She sat down on the bench beside him. "Silas? He's doing this because of me." "Maybe." "Not maybe." He turned the cold coffee cup in his hands. "Even if that's true, and I think you're right that it is, I can't know for certain what he's going to do with the information he's collecting. He might be doing it just to make me uncertain, to make me feel like the ground isn't solid." He paused. "Which is working, a little. I want to be honest about that." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been sitting here thinking about whether I'm in over my head," he said. "The land purchase is a real plan, but it's a big step. And if Ashcroft outbids me for the parcel, I lose the investment I've been planning around and I'm left with the telegraph arrangement with Whitfield, but not the expansion. Which isn't a disaster, it's not what I planned." He looked at the mountains, which were doing what they always did at this hour, turning purple in the last light. "And then I started thinking about whether I could actually, whether what I'm able to offer you is—" "Stop," Evelyn said. He stopped. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't sit here on this bench and talk yourself back into the thing you spent 4 years doing. I've already watched you do that from across the street, and I'm not watching it again from next to you." He was quiet. "I don't care about the parcel," she said. "I care about you deciding that Ashcroft's money makes him more worthy of—" She stopped herself. "You have a stable and a good name and a plan and more integrity than any man I've ever met. That is not a lesser thing." "I know that," he said. "I know it when I'm thinking clearly." "Then think clearly." He looked at her. The evening was settling in around them. The cool of it, the smell of the mountains coming down with the dark. After a moment, something in his expression shifted. The same shift she'd been watching happen in him for 3 weeks now. The gradual setting down of the armor he'd worn for so long, he'd almost forgotten it was there. "I'm going to go talk to the land office tomorrow," he said. "Put in a formal offer on the parcel." "Good. If Ashcroft outbids me, then I'll figure out what comes next." He looked at her. "But I'm not going to sit on the bench and wait for him to make a move and then decide what my life is based on what he does. I'm not doing it that way." "Good," she said again. He put the cold coffee down on the ground beside the bench. He turned and looked at her in the way he was getting better at, directly, without the layering of reasons why not. "Evelyn, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if the timing is wrong." She waited. "I want to come and speak to your father," he said. "Properly. The way it should be done. I know we haven't... It's only been 3 weeks since the store, and I know that's not..." "Ask him," she said. He looked at her. "Ask him," she said. "The timing isn't wrong. The timing is about 4 years late, but it isn't wrong." He nodded once, slowly. "All right," he said. "All right." He went to see Thomas Mercer the following evening, a Friday, after the store had closed. He went in his good shirt again, which Evelyn did not witness, but which Thomas noticed, and which told Thomas everything he needed to know about the seriousness of the visit before a word was spoken. Thomas put on coffee, and they sat at the table in the back room, the same table where Evelyn did the accounts, where Thomas had sat across from his daughter and tried to understand her for 26 years with varying degrees of success. The ledger was closed on the corner of the desk. "I think you know why I'm here," Silas said. "I think I do," Thomas said. "I want to court your daughter properly, with your knowledge and your blessing, if you'll give it." He paused. "I know I should have done this years ago. I'm not going to sit here and make excuses for why I didn't. I was slow about it, and I'm asking you now." Thomas looked at him across the table. He'd known Silas Boone for 8 years, had watched him build the stable from nothing, had seen how he worked and how he treated people, had on 2 occasions seen him manage situations that could have turned ugly with a steadiness that Thomas had noted and remembered. He was not a man who impressed easily, and Silas Boone had impressed him. He was also a father, which meant that no amount of impressive steadiness entirely removed the instinct to examine a man carefully before giving him access to the most important person in Thomas Mercer's world. "My daughter is not a simple woman," Thomas said. "I mean that as a compliment. She's got more going on than most people see, and she has very clear ideas about what she will and won't accept." "I know that," Silas said. "That's part of why it took me 4 years to get here. I was afraid of not being enough for her." "And now?" Silas considered the question. "Now I think the only way to find out is to actually be present in her life and see what I'm made of." He paused. "I'm not going to promise you I'll never disappoint her. I don't think that's a promise any honest man can make. What I can promise is that I'll take it seriously and I'll take her seriously, and I won't make her feel like a secondary consideration." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Blackridge was going about its Friday evening. The sound of the badly tuned instrument from the Miner's Rest found its way down the street even here. "You've heard about Ashcroft looking at the north parcel," Thomas said. "Yes." "Does that worry you?" "It concerns me," Silas said. "I won't pretend otherwise. But it doesn't change what I came here to say." Thomas nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down again. "You have my blessing," he said, "for what it's worth from an old man with a badly maintained ledger, and a daughter who's been managing his accounts for 4 years because she's better at numbers than he is." Something in Silas's face relaxed. A tightness releasing that had been there, Silas realized, since he'd walked through the door. "It's worth a great deal," Silas said. "Good." Thomas stood up, which was a signal that the serious part of the conversation was over, and the part where 2 men could breathe normally could begin. "Now, you want more coffee, or is that it?" "More coffee would be fine," Silas said. They drank it in the back room with the closed ledger on the desk and the sound of the Friday street coming through the window, and they talked about the north parcel and the hay prices and the winter that was coming. And by the time Silas left an hour later, Thomas Mercer had decided that his daughter, who had been right about nearly everything for 26 years, was right about this too. The formal offer on the north parcel went in on Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, word had come back from the land office that there was a competing interest in the property. The land office clerk, a young man named Peters who was not skilled at concealing information, confirmed when pressed that the competing interest had been registered that same morning, within 2 hours of Silas's offer. Silas stood at the land office counter and looked at the paperwork and did the math on the timing, and the math was not ambiguous. Ashcroft had been watching for his move. He walked back to the stable and sat on the bench outside and thought about it with the clean, cold focus he'd had on Wednesday night, which was better than the other kind of thinking, the kind that spiraled. He was a man who, when something was genuinely difficult, got quieter rather than louder, which was either a good quality or a frustrating one depending on whether you were the man or the person watching him. Frank found him there an hour later. "You heard," Frank said. "I heard." Frank sat down. "What are you going to do?" "I need to make a decision about the bid," Silas said. "By Monday. The land office needs a final number by Monday morning. Can you go higher?" "Some. Not." He stopped. "Ashcroft has more money than I do. If he wants to outbid me on pure capital, he can. The question is whether he wants to badly enough to overpay significantly for land he has no particular use for." "He might," Frank said, "if the point is the land isn't about the land." "I know." They sat in the quiet for a moment. Then Frank said, carefully, "There's another way to think about it." "Go ahead." "If you go in Monday with the highest number you can reasonably manage, and Ashcroft is going to beat it, he's going to beat it regardless. You can't outcapitalize him on pure resources." Frank paused. "But what he wants is not actually the land. What he wants is for you to feel like the ground isn't solid, like you can't build what you're trying to build, like Evelyn would be better off with someone whose resources he can't threaten." Silas looked at him. "So the question isn't whether you can beat his bid," Frank said. "The question is whether you're going to keep building regardless of whether you win the bid." Silas thought about this. He thought about Evelyn on the bench saying, "Don't talk yourself back into the thing you spent 4 years doing." He thought about Thomas Mercer saying, "You have my blessing," across a coffee cup in a back room. He thought about the chestnut filly's hoof growing back clean. "There are other parcels," Silas said. "Not as good as the north one, but there are others." "There are," Frank said, "and the Whitfield arrangement stands regardless." "It does." Silas nodded slowly. "I'll go in Monday with my best number on the north parcel. If he beats it, I'll find another parcel and adjust the plan." He looked at Frank. "I'm not going to spend the next 6 months letting that man set the terms of my life." Frank exhaled. "Good," he said. "That's good." What happened on Monday was not what anyone expected. Silas went to the land office with his number. Peters took it in with the particular expression of a young man carrying more information than he was comfortable with. Silas waited on the bench outside while Peters went into the back where the records were kept and whatever administrative process determined these things was conducted. He waited 20 minutes. Peters came back out with a look on his face that was somewhere between confused and relieved. "Mr. Boone," he said, "the competing interest has been withdrawn." Silas stared at him. "Withdrawn?" "Yes, sir. This morning. Early." Peters looked at the paperwork in his hands. "Your offer stands as the only current bid. Pending standard review, the parcel is yours." Silas said nothing for a moment. He looked at Peters to see if the young man was mistaken or confused, but Peters looked certain in the way that people look when they're reading from a document rather than reconstructing from memory. "Thank you," Silas said. He walked back to the stable. He sat down on the bench. He tried to understand what had happened, which required more information than he currently had. The information came that afternoon from a direction he didn't expect. Thomas Mercer came to the stable, which was not something Thomas did generally, and sat down on the bench beside Silas with the deliberate movement of a man who has something to say that he's been preparing. "Ashcroft came to see me this morning," Thomas said. Silas looked at him. "Early," Thomas said, "before I'd opened the store. He came to the house." He folded his hands on his knees. "He said he'd been thinking about his conduct and that he wanted me to know that he intended to withdraw the land bid." Thomas paused. "He also said that he respected Evelyn's decision and that he hoped there would be no lasting damage to any business relationship between us." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I expected from him." "No," Thomas said. "It's not what I expected either." He was quiet for a moment. I think the man has more complexity to him than his behavior over the past week suggested. I'm not excusing it, but I think when he sat with himself long enough, he understood that he'd gone past decent behavior and he chose to come back from it. He paused again. He's not a villain. He's just a man who's used to getting what he wants and doesn't always handle disappointment well. Most people don't handle disappointment well, Silas said. No, Thomas agreed. They don't. They sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet. The parcel is mine, Silas said. Peter's confirmed this morning. Thomas nodded. Good. He stood up. Silas. He said the name the way he'd said Evelyn's name, carefully, like something he was handling with both hands. I want you to know something. When I gave you my blessing Friday evening, it wasn't contingent on how this land business came out. I want to be clear about that. Silas looked at him. I know, he said. Thank you for saying it anyway. Thomas nodded once. He walked back toward the store, and Silas watched him go, and thought about the particular shape of a life that was, piece by piece, becoming something he hadn't entirely dared to imagine. Evelyn heard about Ashcroft's withdrawal from Agnes, who heard it from her husband, who had run into Peter's at the post office. She heard it on Monday afternoon, and she stood in the store with the information for a while, turning it over. She thought about Ashcroft coming to her father's house in the early morning. She thought about what it must have cost him. Not money, not the bid, but the other thing, the acknowledgement. A man like Gideon Ashcroft did not make that kind of visit easily. She didn't like him. She didn't trust that his motives had ever been purely about her rather than about the acquisition of a thing he'd decided he wanted. But she could, in some part of herself that was honest about complexity, acknowledge that he'd done something that was harder than not doing it. She filed this away and went back to the ledger, which had better numbers in it this week than last week. That evening, Silas came to the store at closing time. He came around to the back door, which felt different from the front, more ordinary, more like he was coming to the part of her life that wasn't the public part. She was just finishing the last entries when she heard the knock. She let him in and they sat at the back table, the same table where her father had sat with his coffee, where the ledger lived. And she made tea because the evening was cool enough for it. And she told him what she'd heard about Ashcroft's visit, and he told her what her father had said, and they pieced together the morning from two angles the way people do when they're becoming the kind of people who piece things together from two angles. It's done then, Evelyn said. The land part is done, Silas said. The rest of it is just starting. She looked at him across the table. The tea was too hot, and they were both holding their cups without drinking from them, the way people do when the cup is an excuse to have something to do with their hands. Silas, she said, can I ask you something? Yes. When you were sitting on the bench Monday morning waiting to find out about the bid, what were you thinking? He considered this honestly. I was thinking about what Frank said, about whether I was going to let Ashcroft set the terms of my life. He paused. And I was thinking about the 4 years I already lost to being afraid, and I decided I wasn't going to lose any more time to it, whatever the bid came back as. She nodded. What were you thinking? He asked. She looked at her tea. I was thinking that if he won the bid, I was going to tell you that we'd find another way, that there was always another way. She paused. And I was thinking that I was tired of things being complicated, and that I wanted one simple thing, which was to be with you, and for everything else to be the secondary concern. He looked at her across the table for a long moment. That's the first time you've said that, he said. Said what? That you want to be with me. He said it without drama, just naming the thing. In those words, she looked at him. I've been saying it in other ways for 4 years. I know, he said. I know you have. He stopped. I wanted to hear it once like that. Outside, Blackridge was going quiet in the way it went quiet on Monday evenings. Gradually, the sounds thinning out until the town felt like it was just people and houses, and the mountains pressing against the dark. Inside, the lamp on the table made the room small and warm. I want to be with you, Evelyn said again. Not for the first time, technically, but in the first words, in the direct way. Is that clear enough? Yes, Silas said. Good. She picked up her tea, which was finally a drinkable temperature. Now drink your tea. It's getting cold. He smiled. Not the careful, managed expression he wore in most contexts, but the real one, The one she'd caught glimpses of across 4 years in a street and a counter. The one that changed his whole face. He picked up his cup. The courting, as it actually happened, was not romantic in the way that the word courting sometimes implies. It was Silas showing up at the store on Tuesday evenings after closing to walk Evelyn home, which was a 15-minute walk that sometimes took 40 because they kept stopping to finish sentences. It was Evelyn bringing food to the stable on Saturday afternoons. Not elaborate food, practical food, the kind she made for herself and simply made more of. And eating it on the bench outside while Silas talked through the expansion plans, and she asked questions that made him think harder about the answers. It was two people learning the texture of each other's ordinary days, which was less dramatic than the months preceding it, and more important. There were things that were harder than expected. Silas was not naturally a talker. He'd spent 30 years being a listener, being the steady presence in the room while other people navigated their feelings out loud, and turning that around, learning to say the internal thing rather than just holding it, took more work than he'd anticipated. Evelyn was patient about it in the way she was patient about most things, which was to say she was patient up to a point, and then she said something direct and slightly uncomfortable, and he appreciated it even when it stung. One evening in late May, about 3 weeks into the proper courting, they had their first real argument. It was about the expansion plans, technically. Silas had been talking to a builder about the new stable structure on the north parcel, and he'd made several decisions about the layout without mentioning them to Evelyn. And Evelyn had heard about these decisions from Agnes's husband before she'd heard about them from Silas, which was the actual problem rather than the decisions themselves. "I'm not asking you to consult me on everything," she said. They were in the back room of the store again, which had become their room in some unspoken way, the place where the real conversations happened. "I'm asking you to tell me things before I hear them from other people." "It's my stable," Silas said. Not defensively exactly, but with the particular flatness of a man who is drawing a line. "I know it's your stable." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not trying to run it. I'm saying that if this is what we're doing, then I'd like to hear about the significant decisions from you. That's not the same thing as asking for authority over them." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I didn't think about how it would land if you heard it from someone else first. That's the part I need you to think about." "I will." He paused. "I'm not used to... I've made my own decisions alone for a long time. I'm still learning which ones to share and at what point." "I know," she said. Her voice had come down from the edge it had. "I'm not asking you to change overnight. I'm just telling you what I need." "That's fair," he said. They sat with the tension for a moment, which neither of them tried to paper over with false brightness. And then Evelyn made tea, and they talked about the layout of the new structure, and she pointed out two things that the builder hadn't considered, both of which were correct, and by the end of the evening the argument had done what good arguments do, left them slightly more known to each other than before. Walking home that night, Silas thought about Clara Whitmore, who had left with her family years ago. He and Clara had never argued. Their 18 months together had been pleasant in a way that was, in retrospect, the pleasantness of two people not quite reaching each other. He'd been sad when she left, but the sadness had been manageable in a way that told him something about the depth of what had been there. This, whatever this was becoming with Evelyn, was not manageable in the same way. It had weight to it. It required things from him. That was frightening, and also, underneath the frightening, something he recognized as real in a way that the manageable sadness had not been. He went home and drew out the stable plans and made notes about what Evelyn had said, and the notes were good, and he decided to mention them to the builder as his own observations, which was both practical and slightly dishonest, and he made a note to tell Evelyn that he'd used her ideas, which somehow mattered to him in a way it wouldn't have 6 months ago. Summer came to Blackridge the way it always did, suddenly, after a spring that couldn't quite commit. The mountains shed their snow down to the high elevations, and the valley turned green and the days stretched long in that particular Wyoming way, where the light lasted until 9 in the evening and the air smelled of grass and distance. The stable construction on the north parcel began in June. Silas had hired 2 men from town and contracted a builder from Casper who came recommended by James Whitfield. And the work was loud and constant and satisfying in the way that building things from the ground up is satisfying when you're the one who decided what gets built. Evelyn came out to the parcel on a Saturday in late June to see the framing going up. She stood in the summer heat and looked at the bones of the new structure. The posts and the beams and the skeleton of something that hadn't existed 3 months ago. And she felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "I kept adjusting the plans," Silas said. He was standing beside her with his hat pushed back on his head and sawdust on his shirt, which was not the good shirt, which was a detail she found somehow more comfortable than the good shirt had been. "Every time I looked at the original drawings, I saw something that could be larger, better." He paused. "I think I've been thinking too small for a while. About various things." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a metaphor?" "It might be a metaphor," he said. "I'm not sure I'm skilled enough at metaphors to say definitely." She laughed. He'd been making her laugh more lately, not with performed humor, but with the dry, flat precision of how he sometimes said things, which was its own kind of funny once you were tuned to the frequency of it. "It's going to be good," she said about the stable, and meant it, and also meant the other things she didn't specify. The summer passed in the way that summers do when you're in the middle of something that matters, quickly in retrospect and fully in the living of it. The Simmons account was paid in full by July. The store's cash position recovered. Thomas Mercer, who had been carrying the stress of the spring in the set of his shoulders, gradually put it down, the way a man puts down a weight when the trail finally levels. He watched his daughter and Silas Boone with the careful peripheral attention of a father who knows better than to stare directly. What he saw was two people who were not performing happiness for the town's benefit, but were simply present with each other in a way that was, to his experienced eye, the real thing. He saw his daughter argue with the man and then sit and drink tea with him afterward. He saw Silas come to the store on a Tuesday evening in August when there was nothing particular requiring him and stay for 2 hours because the conversation hadn't finished. He saw the gradual, imperfect, honest work of two people building something that wasn't a romance in the storybook sense, but was far more durable than any storybook version would have been. He was content. He didn't say so, because that wasn't his way, but he was. Agnes Tully watched all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who had been right and was gracious enough not to say so more than 3 or 4 times. The town of Blackridge, which had spent 2 years baffled by Evelyn Mercer's refusal of every eligible man in the county, recalibrated its understanding of the situation with the ease that small towns have when the new story is better than the old one. The new story, Evelyn waiting for Silas, Silas too careful of himself to see it, the whole thing finally coming right, was a better story than the old one, which was just a woman being impossible to please. The new story had a shape people recognized. It made sense in a way that was satisfying. Some of the 7 men she'd turned down received this new story with various degrees of grace. Robert Calloway, who had married a woman from Laramie by August and seemed genuinely happy about it, received it with the most grace of all. He stopped Evelyn on the street one afternoon and said simply, "I always thought it was someone. I'm glad it worked out." She appreciated this more than she told him. Gideon Ashcroft was not seen at the Sunday service after July. His absence was noted and not commented on extensively, which was the town's way of acknowledging something without making it a topic. He returned to the business of running his cattle operation, which was large enough to consume a man's full attention if he allowed it to, and by the time the summer ended, his name was no longer attached to the Mercer-Boone situation in any active way. He had become, in the town's reckoning, a chapter that had ended cleanly, which was a more dignified outcome than the alternative. The evening Silas proposed was in late October, which in Wyoming meant the cold had already arrived with its serious intentions, and the sky had the particular quality it got in autumn, enormous and very clear, the kind of clear that feels like the atmosphere has been scraped clean. They were at the stable. Not the new one on the north parcel, which was still being finished, but the original one on Main Street, the one where Silas had spent the morning of Frank's conversation talking himself into going across the street, the one where 4 years of Thursdays had accumulated into something that had finally become this. It felt right that it was here. Evelyn had come by after supper on no particular errand, just to be there, which was something they'd both gotten comfortable with, the not needing an errand to show up. Silas had been thinking about the proposal for 6 weeks. He'd thought about the right moment, a Sunday afternoon maybe, or on the parcel with the new stable visible behind them, or somewhere with a view of the mountains. He'd thought about what he would say, and revised it, and revised the revision. He'd thought about the ring, which had belonged to his mother and which he'd carried in a small cloth bag in his coat pocket for the past 3 weeks, waiting. What happened instead was that they were standing in the original stable, in the October cold that came in through the wide doors, and Evelyn was talking about the store's winter inventory, what her father planned to order from the Cheyenne suppliers, what she thought they were over-ordering, and what they were likely to run short on. And he was listening, and in the middle of her sentence about woolen blankets, he thought, I do not want to wait one more day to ask her. Not because the moment was perfect. It wasn't. She was in the middle of a sentence about woolen blankets. The stable smelled like horses and hay and the particular October cold, and the lamp they'd brought out was not arranged for romance, but for practicality, throwing its light in useful rather than flattering directions. Evelyn, he said. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at him. Something in his face or his voice had shifted, and she heard it immediately, the way she heard most things about him now. What? She said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the small cloth bag and set it on the work table between them. He didn't open it yet. He looked at her. I've been trying to find the right moment for this for 6 weeks, he said. I've thought about doing it somewhere scenic or on a Sunday, or with some kind of speech prepared that said everything I mean properly. He paused. I don't have a speech. We're in a stable, and it's cold, and you were talking about woolen blankets. She looked at the cloth bag on the table and then back at him. She didn't say anything. I wasted 4 years being afraid of not being enough, he said. I don't want to waste any more time arranging things perfectly when the thing I actually want is just to ask you. He opened the cloth bag and took out the ring, which was a plain gold band with a small setting, modest and old and real in the way of things that have been handled by people who meant them. This was my mother's. It's not elaborate. I can get something different if you want something different. I don't want something different, Evelyn said. Her voice was not entirely steady. Evelyn Mercer. He looked at her across the work table with the lamp throwing its practical light and the horses doing their patient breathing in the stalls behind them. I love you. I should have said it 4 years ago, and I didn't, and I've been making up for that since May, and I intend to keep making up for it. Will you marry me? She looked at him for a moment. The ring, his face, the stable, the whole imperfect and completely honest arrangement of it. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. I've been saying yes to this for 4 years. He came around the table. She met him halfway, which was, she thought, the most accurate description of what they'd been doing since May and would presumably keep doing. He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which felt like the universe being cooperative for once. And she looked at it on her hand and thought about Thomas Mercer saying, I always thought it was someone. And Agnes saying, well, and Frank saying, I've known you since we were 10 years old, and the whole long unwinding of 4 years of Thursdays, and silence, and waiting, coming to rest in this moment, in this stable, in the cold October evening. It fits, she said. I noticed, Silas said. He had his hands around hers, warming them, which was practical and also not. Your mother's ring, she said. She'd have liked you, he said. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't apologetic about them. He paused. I mean that as the highest compliment. Evelyn laughed. The sound of it went up into the rafters of the old stable, and the horses shifted at the sound, the mild and unconcerned movement of animals for whom human emotion was weather, present, noted, and not particularly their concern. We should tell my father, Evelyn said. We should, Silas agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Silas. Yes, I need you to know something. She looked up at him. I wasn't just waiting for you to see me. I was waiting because I already knew what kind of man you were, and I didn't want any other kind. She paused. You didn't need to be afraid of not being enough. You were exactly enough. You've always been exactly enough. He held on to this for a moment. He was not a man who received things easily, compliments, reassurance, the generous, direct statements of people who meant them. He'd spent 30 years being the steady, dependable one, which meant he was practiced at giving those things and unpracticed at taking them in. Thank you, he said, finally. Not reflexively, with the pause that meant he actually meant it. You're welcome, she said. They told Thomas that evening. He was in the parlor of the house behind the store when they came in, And he looked up from his reading and saw their faces and the ring on his daughter's hand and the expression on Silas Boone's face, and he set his book down. "Well," he said, just that one word, and in it was 26 years of raising a daughter alone and hoping he'd done it right, and the particular relief of a father who can see that his child has found a person worth finding. "We're engaged," Evelyn said, because apparently someone needed to say it plainly. "I can see that." Thomas stood up. He put his hand out to Silas, and Silas took it, and they shook hands in the way of men who have said the important things to each other already and don't need to say them again. Then Thomas did something he almost never did. He put his arms around his daughter briefly, the stiff and slightly awkward hug of a man who is not practiced at physical affection, and held on for a moment. "Your mother would have been glad," he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just out loud. Evelyn held on to him for a moment longer than she usually would. "I know," she said. They stayed for an hour and drank coffee and talked about nothing consequential. The winter inventory, the stable expansion, Frank's family, and the ring sat on Evelyn's hand and the lamp burned steadily, and Thomas Mercer looked at the two of them across the room and thought about time, about how long things take and how suddenly they arrive, and he was content in the deep way that doesn't require saying. The wedding was set for the last week of November, before the worst of the winter but after the harvest work was finished, when people had time to come from the surrounding ranches and homesteads. Evelyn and Agnes planned it in the practical way they did most things, with a clear list, a realistic budget, and no illusions about what a Wyoming November wedding would or wouldn't include. Agnes was characteristically helpful, and characteristically unable to resist saying, at one point, "I knew since last January. I want it on record that I knew since January." "It's on record," Evelyn said. "I just want credit." "Agnes, you'll have credit for the rest of your life. Now, help me figure out the flowers, because there are not a lot of flowers in Wyoming in November." There were not a lot of flowers in Wyoming in November. They solved this with pine branches and dried wildflowers that Agnes had the foresight to press in late summer. And the result was not elaborate, but it was real, and it smelled like the season, which seemed right. Frank was Silas's best man. He took this responsibility seriously in the way he took most things, which meant he prepared a toast that he rehearsed on his wife 3 times, and which made her cry on the 3rd run-through, which he considered a good sign. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Silas and Evelyn had one more significant conversation, the kind that couples have when the abstract question of a shared life becomes a concrete one. It was about where they would live. The house behind the stable was 3 rooms and a loft. The house behind the store was slightly larger but belonged to Thomas. The north parcel, when the stable was finished, would have space for a proper house to be built. "We could start in the rooms behind the stable," Evelyn said, "while the parcel house is being planned." "It's not large," Silas said. He said this factually, not apologetically. "I know. I've seen it." She paused. "Silas, I grew up in the back of a store. I'm not concerned about the square footage. There are things I'd want to fix before you're living there," he said. "The kitchen situation it's not a real kitchen." "What is it?" "It's a stove and a shelf and a hope," he said. She pressed her lips together against a smile. "We'll fix the kitchen." "I'll fix it before November," he said. "I'll get it done." He did. He spent 3 Sundays in October improving the kitchen situation from a stove and a shelf and a hope to something that a woman who had grown up in the back of a store could reasonably work in. And he did it himself rather than hiring it out because there was something in the doing of it with his own hands that felt like the right preparation for what was coming. The morning he finished, he stood in the small kitchen and looked at what he'd built and thought about the ring on Evelyn's finger and the patent leather formality of the proposal in the stable and the letter he still owed his mother's memory. And he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has stopped talking himself out of his own life and started building it instead. It was 3 rooms and a loft and a fixed kitchen and a stable full of horses and a parcel of land with a new structure going up on it. It wasn't the Ashcroft Mansion. It wasn't the Callaway Ranch. It was enough. More than enough. He turned off the lamp and went back to work. The wedding was on a Thursday. Evelyn noticed this only the morning of, when she was standing in her father's bedroom in her dress. Her mother's dress, altered to fit her by a woman in town who worked with cloth the way Silas worked with leather, carefully and with respect for the material. And the realization landed with the particular weight of things that are small and meaningful at the same time. Every other Thursday, for years, Supply days. 3 minutes across the counter. Thank you, said with a pause that meant it. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her father's washstand and thought, well, of all the days to pick. She hadn't picked it consciously. Neither had Silas. It had come down to the town hall's availability and the weather window and the practical reality of getting people in from the surrounding ranches before the serious snow arrived. Thursday had simply been the day that worked, but she stood there in her mother's altered dress and the morning light of late November and thought that maybe there were things that had a shape to them regardless of how carefully you tried to arrange them otherwise. 4 years of Thursdays leading to this one. She wasn't sure what to do with that thought exactly, so she filed it away and went to find her father. Thomas was in the kitchen, dressed in his good coat, standing at the window with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He heard her come in and turned around, and his face did the thing it had been doing more often lately, showing things that he had spent most of her childhood keeping carefully behind the practical exterior. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like her," he said. Evelyn didn't say anything. She knew who he meant. She'd have had opinions about the dress, he said. About the alterations. She always had opinions about alterations. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She'd have been right, probably. She usually was. About most things, Evelyn agreed. He nodded once. He set the cup down and came across the kitchen and offered her his arm in the formal way, the way he'd been practicing for this in his head, without anyone knowing he'd been practicing. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you nervous?" She considered this honestly. "No," she said. "I've been ready for this for 4 years. Nervous would require some uncertainty about the outcome." Something moved across Thomas Mercer's face that was as close to a laugh as he usually got in serious moments. "That's my daughter," he said. They walked to the town hall in the November cold with the sky doing its enormous Wyoming thing above them. And the cold was real and the ground was frozen and her breath made small clouds in the air. And none of it was how the illustrated magazine suggested a wedding morning should look. And it was exactly right. Silas was already there. Of course he was. He was the kind of man who was early to things. Not anxiously early, but the early of someone who respects the occasion enough to be settled before it begins. He was standing near the front of the hall with Frank beside him, and he was in his good coat, and he'd done something with his hair that suggested effort had been made, though the result was imperfect in the particular way his results usually were when aesthetics rather than function were the goal. He saw her come in, and the expression on his face was one she'd seen before, the real one, the one that changed everything about his face, but with a quality she hadn't seen before, something that was all the weight of the past months and the 4 years before that, compressed into a single moment of a man seeing the woman he'd almost let slip past him walking toward him instead. She crossed the hall to him in the assembled town of Blackridge, about 60 people, which for a late November Thursday was a significant turnout, testimony to what happens when a town has been invested in a story for 2 years and finally gets to see how it ends. Watched her do it, and the watching was warm rather than intrusive, the watching of people who were genuinely glad. "Thursday," Silas said quietly when she reached him. "I know," she said. "I just noticed." "So did I." He looked at her. The dress, her face, the cold air that had put color in her cheeks, all of it. And then he said simply, "You're here." "I told you I would be," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you did." Frank, standing slightly to the left, was already working to maintain a dignified expression and not entirely succeeding. His wife, in the front row, had already given up on dignified and was simply letting her face do what it wanted. The ceremony was not long. The justice of the peace was a man named Harold Birch, who had been performing weddings in the county for 20 years and understood that the ceremony itself was usually the least important part of a marriage. The important parts came before and after, in the private negotiations of two lives learning to occupy the same space. He said what needed saying, clearly and without embellishment. When he asked Silas, Silas said "I do" with the same quality he brought to everything. The pause first, the weight of actually meaning it, and then the words. When he asked Evelyn, she said "I do" without the pause, because she'd been saying it for 4 years already, and the words were the easiest part. Silas put the ring on her finger over his mother's ring, which Evelyn had worn since October, and which now had a companion on the same hand. He'd gotten the second ring made by the jeweler in Casper, plain gold, matched to the first. Together they sat on her finger with the comfortable solidity of things that belonged there. Frank's toast, delivered at the small reception in the back room of the Miners' Rest, which was the only venue large enough for the crowd and which had been cleared of its usual furniture and filled with tables, made Agnes's husband cry, which Frank had not expected and which Agnes had entirely predicted. The toast was not eloquent in the polished sense. Frank was not a polished man. It was honest, which was better. He talked about knowing Silas since they were 10 years old and recognizing, only in retrospect, all the moments when Silas had been quietly working up to this without knowing he was working up to it. He talked about sitting on the bench outside the stable the evening he'd told Silas the truth, and the look on Silas's face that he'd carry with him the rest of his life. The look of a man realizing that the thing he'd been protecting himself from was the thing he actually needed. He ended with something that was simple enough that it landed hard. To two people, he said, who are better together than either of them knew they could be, and to the town that had to watch them figure it out. The room laughed and raised their glasses, and Silas looked at Frank across the room with the expression of a man who has no adequate response to 30 years of friendship. So he simply nodded, and Frank nodded back, and that was sufficient. The snow came that night, not the blizzard kind, just the steady, serious snow of a Wyoming winter settling in for its long stay, covering the streets and the rooftops and the mountains in the particular silence that snow makes, which is the closest thing to actual quiet that a frontier town ever gets. Silas and Evelyn walked back to the stable together through the first real snowfall of the season, their footprints the first marks in the new white, and she was still in her mother's altered dress with his coat over her shoulders because the coat was warmer than anything she'd worn, and he'd given it to her without being asked, and she'd taken it without arguing, which was already a better version of how they'd been doing things 6 months ago. The 3 rooms behind the stable were warm. Silas had banked the fire before the ceremony, thinking ahead in the way he thought ahead about most things. And the kitchen, the fixed kitchen, the one that was no longer a stove and a shelf and a hope, had a pot of something on it that Frank's wife had quietly arranged to be there, because Frank's wife understood logistics. Evelyn stood in the middle of the small front room and looked around at it. The low ceiling, the single window with the snow falling past it, the fire doing its steady work in the corner, and thought about the Ashcroft mansion that she'd never seen the inside of and never would, and the Callaway Ranch, and the various other futures she'd been offered and declined. "It's small," Silas said, watching her. "I know, I said I didn't mind small. You might mind it more in February." "Silas," she turned and looked at him. "Stop waiting for me to change my mind. I'm not going to change my mind." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something he'd gotten better at over the past months. He let the worry go instead of carrying it around looking for confirmation. "All right," he said. "The kitchen is good," she said. "You did a good job with the kitchen." "Thank you. I mean it. It's a real kitchen now. It's still not large." "Stop," she said, but she was almost smiling. "Stopping," he said. The first winter of their marriage was the ordinary difficult kind. Cold in a way that required constant management, the wood supply needing constant attention, the stable requiring twice the work because cold horses needed more than comfortable horses. Silas was out before light most mornings, and Evelyn was up not long after, and there was a period in January where both of them were so tired by evening that their conversations were reduced to necessary information and occasional complete sentences. They got through it without drama, which was its own kind of accomplishment. There were harder things than the cold. They were two people with established habits of solitude, both of them, and learning to share space without eroding each other's sense of themselves was a quieter struggle than the cold, but a more persistent one. Silas had spent 30 years making his own decisions in his own time, and the adjustment to sharing, really sharing, not just informing, was slower than he'd expected. Evelyn had spent 26 years managing things, and letting someone else carry part of the weight required a trust that she had to practice consciously rather than feel automatically. There were weeks when they were off rhythm with each other in ways that were hard to name. Weeks where the small irritations accumulated and had to be addressed rather than ignored, which required conversations that neither of them was naturally inclined toward. Silas's first response to conflict was still to go quiet in a way that Evelyn found more maddening than anger would have been. Her first response was still to solve the problem independently and tell him after, which he found more frustrating than she'd expected. They managed it imperfectly, which is to say they managed it like people, which is the only available option. By the time the spring came again, they had a better map of each other than the winter had given them. Not a complete map. You never get a complete map of another person, but enough to navigate by. Enough to know which silences meant something needed saying and which ones were just Silas being Silas, quiet and solid and present without requiring noise to prove it. Enough to know that when Evelyn stopped asking for help, it wasn't because things were fine, but because she'd reached her asking limit and needed a different kind of approach. They learned these things the way you learn things that matter. Slowly, imperfectly, and without any guarantee that the learning would hold. The house on the north parcel was finished in the spring of the second year. It was not large by some standards, but it was real. A proper house, 2 stories, with a kitchen that didn't require apology, and a porch that looked toward the mountains. The stable beside it was everything Silas had planned, and a few things he hadn't, because Evelyn had caught 3 things in the final drawings that the builder had missed, and the builder had incorporated her corrections and then tried to thank Silas for them, and Silas had said, "Those are my wife's observations," which had made Evelyn look up from the plans with an expression he'd filed away to think about later. They moved into the new house on a Saturday in April. It took 2 trips with the wagon and the help of Frank and Frank's 2 oldest boys, who were 10 and 12, and treated the whole enterprise as an adventure. By evening, the furniture was placed imperfectly, and the kitchen was stocked adequately, and the porch was swept, and the mountains were doing their evening thing with the light. They sat on the porch that first evening with coffee and the April cold that was still real even though spring had technically arrived, and Silas looked at what he'd built and felt the specific satisfaction of a man whose life has arrived at a place his younger self would not have known how to picture. "Frank's boys are good workers," Evelyn said. "They are. Frank raised them right. The oldest one's going to be tall." "He already is." Silas paused. "Evelyn." "Yes. Are you happy?" He asked it the way he asked things that mattered, without decoration, just the question, set down plainly between them. She looked at the mountains. She thought about what the word meant, which was a question she didn't think about lightly. Happy was not the constant warm glow that the word sometimes implied in other people's usage. Happy, in her experience, was more intermittent than that. It came in specific moments, and between the moments was the ordinary work of a life, which was neither happy nor unhappy, but simply what it was. "Yes," she said. "Not every minute, but yes." "That's all I wanted to know," he said. "What about you?" He considered it with the same seriousness she'd given it. "Yes," he said. "More than I knew how to expect." Their daughter was born in the winter of the 3rd year. They named her Ruth, after Silas's mother, which was Silas's suggestion and Evelyn's immediate agreement, and which Thomas Mercer received with the expression of a grandfather being informed for the first time that he was a grandfather, an expression that required several minutes to settle into something he could wear in public. Ruth arrived in the world with strong opinions, expressed loudly, which Silas took as a sign that she was her mother's daughter, and Evelyn took as a sign that she was her father's daughter, and they were probably both right. She was a healthy baby, and then a healthy child, and then a girl who asked questions that required real thought before you could answer them, which was both exhausting and exactly what everyone who knew her parents had expected. Their son came 2 years after Ruth. They named him Thomas, after Evelyn's father, which produced in Thomas Mercer the expression of a man receiving something he had not known he wanted until it was handed to him. The children grew up in the house on the north parcel, with the stable as their playground and the mountains as their backdrop, which was not a bad way to grow up. They knew the horses by name, and the horses knew them by smell. And Frank's children came over on weekends, and there were usually muddy boots by the door and voices in the yard, and the kind of noise that a house makes when it is actually being lived in rather than just occupied. The store continued. Evelyn had taken on more of the management as her father's energy settled into something slower, and she brought to it the same practical intelligence she'd brought to the accounts for years. She negotiated better terms with the Cheyenne suppliers than her father had managed. Not because she was harder, but because she was clearer, which is sometimes more effective than hard. She hired a girl from town to help with the counter 3 days a week so she could spend the other days at the house, which was not a perfect arrangement, but was a workable one. The stable on the north parcel became, over several years, the operation Silas had planned it to be. His reputation spread in the practical way that reputation spread on the frontier, through the recommendations of people who had been well served and said so to other people who needed the same service. He employed 2 men by the 4th year and 3 by the 6th, and the work was good and steady and enough. They were not wealthy. They were, by any honest accounting, comfortable, which on the Wyoming frontier in the 1880s was something that had to be actively maintained rather than passively enjoyed. There were years where the hay prices were bad, and years where a sickness moved through the horses, and years where the winter was worse than it had any business being. They managed these things the way they managed most things, together, imperfectly, without the pretense that the other person was obligated to pretend things were fine when they weren't. Thomas Mercer lived to see both grandchildren walking. He died in the autumn of the 6th year, quietly, which was how he had done most things, the heart simply deciding one evening that it had done sufficient work. Evelyn had been there. She sat with him for the last hour of his life in the back room of the store where the ledger lived, and he was not in pain and he was not afraid. And the last thing he said to her was something practical about the Cheyenne supplier account that she'd already handled, which she told him, and he nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose affairs were in order, and then he slept and did not wake. She grieved him the way you grieve a person whose whole life you understood well enough to miss specifically, not just the fact of him, but the particular shape of him, his hands on the coffee cup, the way he said her name carefully when he had something difficult to say. The stiff, impractical hug he'd given her the night she'd come home with Silas's ring on her finger. Silas sat with her through the grief without trying to fix it, which was what she needed, and which he'd learned enough about her by now to know. He brought food and kept the children occupied and let her have the evenings when she needed to sit with her father's ledgers in the back room and feel the weight of the absence. And one night when she came out of the store and sat on the bench outside where he was waiting, she said, "He knew, at the end, that things were good." "He knew," Silas said. "He told me once, the night after you came to see him. He said he always thought it was someone. He was glad." "I know," Silas said. "He told me something like that too, the evening we drank coffee in the back room." She looked at him. "He told you that?" "He didn't say it directly, but it was in what he said." Silas paused. "He was proud of you. He was glad you didn't settle. He said something. He said, some people make their decisions based on what's available, and some people make them based on what they actually need. And the second kind are harder to live with and better to be." He paused. "I think he meant it as a compliment to you and maybe a mild warning to me." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. "It did to me too." They sat on the bench outside the store in the autumn evening, and the mountains were doing their October thing with the colors. And Evelyn held her grief and her gratitude in the same moment the way you do when someone you love has had a full life and still you miss them. It was Ruth who asked the question, at the age of 9, that Evelyn had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. They were in the kitchen of the North Parcel house, Ruth and her mother, on a winter afternoon when the weather had locked them inside and Silas was at the stable and Thomas was asleep in the way of 6-year-olds who crash without warning. Ruth was sitting at the table watching her mother work, which was something she did often, sat and watched and stored things up for later examination. "Mama," she said. "Yes." "How did you know Papa was the one you wanted to marry?" Evelyn kept her hands working for a moment. She thought about how to answer this honestly, which was the only way she'd ever found worth answering things to Ruth, who could detect dishonesty with the accuracy of an animal that has survived by developing exactly that skill. "I watched how he did things," she said. "Not the big things, the small ones. How he talked to his horses. How he said thank you. How he showed up when he said he would and didn't make excuses when things were hard." Ruth considered this. "But lots of men could do those things." "Some. Not as many as you'd think." Evelyn paused. "But it wasn't only what he did. It was who he was when he didn't know anyone was watching. That's the real version of a person." "Were you watching when he didn't know?" "For about 4 years," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her with the expression she had when she was deciding whether an adult was telling her the full truth. "Why didn't you just tell him?" Evelyn set down what she was working with and looked at her daughter, 9 years old, with Silas's steady eyes and her own crooked instinct for getting to the point of things. "Because I was waiting for him to see it himself," she said, which was partly about being a woman in 1883 in Wyoming, and partly about the fact that I wanted him to choose me, Not just to respond to being chosen. She paused. But I also waited longer than I should have. I kept thinking the patience was the wise choice when actually it was starting to become its own kind of fear. What were you afraid of? Being wrong, Evelyn said. Being told no. Wanting something that much and having it not work. She looked at her daughter steadily. Love is like most things that matter. It requires you to be willing to be wrong about it, to take the risk of being wrong and do it anyway. Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Outside, the snow was doing its steady work on the world. Papa was afraid too, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he was afraid he wasn't enough, which was the wrong fear, but fear usually is wrong. That's what makes it hard. It feels like wisdom. It feels like you're being careful, but sometimes careful is just another word for waiting until the decision gets made for you. Ruth looked at the table. Then she looked up. He stopped being afraid. He did. When it mattered. That's the important part. Not that he was never afraid, but that he stopped letting the fear do his deciding. Evelyn picked up what she'd been working with. That's what I want you to remember, if you remember anything from this conversation. Not that love is patient. Love does need patience. But love also needs someone to speak first eventually, or it just becomes a long, quiet story about two people who almost... Ruth said nothing for a moment. Then, almost what? Almost everything, Evelyn said. Ruth sat with this in the 9-year-old way of sitting with things. Not fully, not yet, but storing it for the later version of herself who would understand it more completely. That was fine. That was what children were supposed to do with the things adults said that were too large to fit yet. Silas came in an hour later, cold from the stable and slightly irritated about a fence situation on the north parcel that he'd been working on all afternoon, and he tracked snow through the kitchen that Evelyn had just swept, which she noted with the expression she had for this recurring situation. He said sorry in the automatic way of a man who knows he's going to keep doing the thing he's apologizing for. Ruth watched this exchange with the attention of a field researcher observing a known species. "Papa?" she said. "Yeah." He was pulling off his coat. "Mama told me how she knew she wanted to marry you." He stopped. He glanced at Evelyn, who gave him a look that was benign and slightly amused. "Is that right?" he said. "She said she watched you when you didn't know she was watching." "For a long time," Silas said. 4 years. "About that." He hung his coat on the hook, which he usually missed and today didn't. "Did she tell you I was slow about it?" "She said you were afraid." He came to the table and sat down across from his daughter. He looked at her with the steady, honest attention he gave most things. "I was," he said, "for a long time." "What changed?" "Frank told me the truth," he said, "and I decided the fear wasn't worth what it was costing me." Ruth seemed to be measuring this against what her mother had said, checking the two accounts for consistency, finding them consistent in the way that true stories are consistent, not identical, but pointing the same direction from different angles. "Okay," she said, and slid off her chair and went to find something else to do, the way children do when they've gotten what they came for. Silas looked at Evelyn across the kitchen. 4 years, he said. "I mentioned it," she said. "You were hard on me." "I was accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. The kitchen, the snow at the window, the sound of Ruth doing something in the next room that probably involved more noise than necessary, Thomas still asleep in the afternoon quiet. 14 years since the store in the morning with the closed sign, and her saying, obviously, yes. I've been saying yes for 4 years. 14 years of managed finances and difficult winters and imperfect adjustments, and the particular sustained work of two people who chose each other and kept choosing. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "I'm not afraid anymore," he said. "I just want you to know that. Not of this. Not of us." She looked at him across the kitchen. The afternoon light was the low winter kind, honest and unglamorous. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "Good," he said. Outside, the snow kept falling on Black Ridge and the mountains and the north parcel and the stable and the house that Silas had built and Evelyn had made into the kind of place that children came home to and the kind of place that two people who had almost been a long, quiet story about almost had instead made into something that would outlast them both. Not perfect, not without cost, Not without the ordinary damage that living together accumulates over years and that you repair, imperfectly, and then live with the repaired version which is never quite the original but is sometimes stronger in the broken places than it was before. Just real. Just chosen. Just theirs. That was enough. More than enough.